If you're getting frustrated currently on the patch because playing flexibly and wide is just not working out, look no further than Duelist, a composition that's currently carrying a lot of players to top ranks on ladder. But the thing is, Duelists are not as easy as they used to be in previous sets. There's a lot of nuance and things that really take them over the top. By the end of this video, you should be able to master Duelist and take on any billionaire gamers or maybe the creator of TFT himself. Before we start, credit where credit is due. I first noticed on the previous patch that a player named Bossoskills was climbing really high in North America, basically just one-tricking Duelists. He climbed to as high as top 10 North America in 1500 LP before having a couple of bad games, but for the most part had mastered and refined Duelist, and then taught some of the other top players in North America how to play it. One of the players in this practice group is Weird, aka Force Smurf account, a player that made it to Set 10's World Championship. He hit top 5 North America this patch, getting as high as 1700 LP, almost one-tricking Duelists. You may notice that he's just gained hundreds and hundreds of LP playing this line mainly and climbing very, very high with it. Bossoskills also helped me build this guide, so big shout out to him. Check out our stream, twitch.tv/Bossoskills. And if you want to see Weird either compete or ever stream, twitch.tv/WeirdTFT. The gameplay for Duelist is pretty straightforward. You always really want to play it from a head or a win streak. The only times you don't really play from win streak is if you're playing Fine Vintage, and that's because Fine Vintage forces you to lose streak because you have to wait several rounds before you can get the payoff of multiple support items. And even then, taking Fine Vintage into Duelist can be kind of tricky if you're playing on a low item setup. But Duelists are really good at pushing early game advantage because a lot of the units are cheap and they're very effective, snowballing and beating up on people that have weak front lines. And if you can get to the back line, you oftentimes can assassinate before they ramp up in time. Duelists also want 3 combat augments. You don't always get it, but you try to do it as best as you can. Sometimes you do have to take like item-based augments, or maybe you end up taking econ because, you know, that's just like a situation where it calls for it. Like maybe you go prismatic ticket into rolling for all the 3 stars or something like that. But for the most part, you always want 3 combat augments that buff the strength of your board, and specifically some of your star Duelists. You often want to roll on level 6 for 2 upgrades. This is specifically for 2 upgrades on your Duelists. And a lot of times on level 6, you're rolling for the 2 and potentially 3 cost. You don't really have that high odds of hitting the 3 cost 2 stars, but sometimes if you have like multiple pairs, let's say you have Kiana pair and Darius pair, Yasuo pair, and a Volibear pair, you roll a couple times, you might see that Volibear 2 and you snowball stage 3. If you continue win streaking in stage 3, you can also level to 7 early, like at stage 3-5, and then lightly roll for some of the 3 costs because those are the best odds that you can hit. And then also at level 7, you can sometimes hit like the Lee Sin one, or maybe even a crazy legendary to help spike your board. But try not to roll too much at 7 because you still want to get to level 8 ultimately. Reroll is a little bit strange right now. In general, you're supposed to be 1 level ahead of where you usually are. So in the past, if you rolled for 2 costs, you want to stay on 6. If you want to roll for 3 costs, you stayed on 7. Now it's like 1 up because of the odds changes. So now a lot of 3 cost rerolls want to go to 8 because a lot of 4 or 5 costs are really powerful and you can spike them to get really big power access to your board. So that's why you don't want to roll too much on 7 because you don't get stuck there. If you're playing keepers, you always want to clump for the front 2 rows and get a lot of value. This is just a big note because if you ever take keepers, chances are you're just pretty much going to play Duelist right now currently on the patch. And that includes things like Irelia and Tristana and even some of the support units you play in the back. The best openers are Volibear as the best item holder, over Kiana, over Darius, over Yasuo. And I would try to play 2-star as a priority over the 1-stars in general. So if you have like Yasuo 2 and 1-star everything else, I'd probably itemize Yasuo 2. And that applies to Darius 2 as well. Darius 2 over Yasuo 2, Kiana 2 over Darius 2, and then Volibear over Kiana 2. So it just kind of chain reacts at that point. So just always Volibear, Kiana, Darius, Yasuo. Anti-heal is very important by mid and late game. A lot of people sometimes ignore this because they're too busy building like Bloodthirster Titans and trying to get all the best in slot items for their carries. They ignore anti-heal and then they get stuck on some really problematic tanks. So make sure you always build anti-heal. And then Sunder is always a big question mark because Irelia has Sunder built into her kit. So a lot of people feel like building Last Whisper and Even Shroud is a waste of resources. But sometimes tempo matters so much that it's okay to build things like Last Whisper and Even Shroud before you get to Irelia, because that is what's going to help you win streak and then be able to play from ahead. So that way Irelia can be your capstone to really get a strong win. Okay, game plan part 2. What are the actual game plans of what you want to build with your composition? There's mainly 2 different variations of Duelist to think about. One is a tempo-oriented push levels and try to win streak and don't reroll. The other is to stay at level 7/level 8 and reroll for it. In a lot of cases right now, most people are playing tempo Duelist. They're not actually trying to stay and reroll for Volibear 3 and Tristana 3 and maybe some other things like Diana 3. And that's because of a couple of reasons. One, it's just harder to justify rerolling when you're really far ahead. If you're like 100 HP win streaking and you're pushing levels, it feels more correct to push levels in general, because staying at that level and then rerolling kind of halts your momentum. And if you miss, you kind of bleed out and lose all the advantage because you never got stronger. You're stuck there on level 8, rolling for Tristana 3, Volibear 3, and you never hit. And then throughout like a stage and a half, your board doesn't actually improve, even though you're spending a bunch of gold. Leveling up is a much more consistent way to improve your board, and you can roll for 5 costs, which ultimately is stronger. So you're going to be playing this game plan a lot as your primary game plan. And it's also really nice because if you're contested duelist, it's not that big of a deal because all you really need is just 2-star everything. Yeah, it's going to be kind of annoying to hit Irelia 2 when you're contested, but that's fine. You should be able to at least out-tempo them and secure a top 4 and maybe play for a top 2 or better. If you have a good Exalted, that's a really good time to also play tempo because you just need more team slots onto your board. You just need actually more unit spaces so you can fit in the Exalted units. Or when you have things like +1 emblems, +1 Duelist, +1 Dragon Lord, and you want to get to 8 Duelist or 4 Dragon Lord, you just need actually more team size space. So that's why it's really important to go for that. The general game plan is to fast 8, find Lee Sin 2, itemize him, have Sages so you can stabilize with the Omnivamp in the front, and then push to level 9. This right here is probably the hardest part of playing Duelist, because if you don't find Lee Sin 2, you're going to have to be a little bit creative with how you build your board. And also, you have to try to avoid rolling to 0, because that's just going to make getting to 9 really hard, and therefore rolling for 5 costs is going to be difficult. Sometimes just have to nuke your economy and roll to 0 because you need to stabilize and play for a top 4. And those kinds of spots are all lobby dependent. So that's really up to you to get experience of learning when you actually have to spend all your resources to roll to 0 and when you can stop rolling and push to level 9. When you get to level 9, 4 Dragon Lord is generally like a lot of ways how people cap out if they don't have a Duelist emblem. A lot of people do play 8 Duelists, and you put it onto a strong unit like Wukong or Rakan. And ultimately, like, Wukong is just another carry you can play alongside all of your Duelists. And then you have Irelia 2, Wukong 2, Rakan 2, and then you just have too much value. You just win the game. The other game plan is to reroll, and you play it from like high economy starts. You're talking about a portal that gives you a bunch of gold, like gold subscription or Crab Rave. You have a situational encounter. Let's say it's like a Zoe odd levels thing, so you have to roll at 7. Or you get like a Loon, which gives you the 2-star 3 cost, so you just get like an extra Volibear 2 out of nowhere. Yeah, chase for Volibear 3 at that point. Or if you're just like naturally a bunch of copies, like you just happen to just pick up like, 6 Tristanas on your way to 4-1, and then all of a sudden you get offered something that gives you another Tristana, and then you're just like, okay, I have 7 Tristanas, I'm just going to go for it. If you do, you want to slow roll for Volibear 3 and Tristana 3 above 50 gold, and it's most likely going to be at level 8, but you can actually play it at level 7 pending on the situation. At level 7, if you do end up getting stuck with it, make sure to play around 6 Duelists and Malphite and Nico, because the heavenly stats are really nice. Malphite give you resistances, which synergize really nicely with the damage reduction. Same thing with Nico's HP. Both of them are really good stats. And the win condition here is just pretty straightforward. Just 3-star Duelist and just have too many high tier units to deal with. Here's the ideal way your board develops throughout the game. At level 4, you're going to start off with the very nice clean synergy of Darius, Malphite, Kiana, and Yorick. This is perfect synergy board. And then at level 5, you can add in something like Nico, for example, because you can always get away with +1 Heavenly, but adding 1 Behemoth, 1 Heavenly, 1 Umbral doesn't do much. At level 6, you want to try to see if you can get 4 Duelists plus the Heavenly. You can also go for 6 Duelists if you hit it with +1 Emblem. Level 7, we kind of talked about playing around Malphite and Nico with the Duelists. This is an example of playing 4 Duelists, but if you hit Lee Sin, you can always go for the 6 immediately. And level 8, this is kind of the ideal board. You're transitioning out of units like Darius, who's been item holder. Instead, you tech in Yasuo because he at least adds in a little bit more utility through shielding. And then if you hit Irelia, great. If you hit Wukong, great. And if you hit Rakan, great. Slot them all in. This is what you play at level 9. It's not always going to look this clean and pretty, but this is the ideal set to give you an idea of flow of how to develop your board. Now, the big question is, what if you don't hit things like Lee Sin 2? Because the reality is you're contested, or somehow, I don't know why, but this patch, it feels like even if you are uncontested, you still don't hit. What do you do if you're stuck Lee Sin 1 and you don't really hit anything else? Well, here are a couple things that you could do. The first is that I think people really sleep on just having Sages in general onto your board. They just offer a lot of value, and they could be pretty decent item holders, especially if you have generic items like Morello, Gunblade, Giant Slayer, like things that don't necessarily have to go on AD champions. You can put it on a Morgana 2 and then have Morgana plus Duelist do a lot of work. And you can even have units like Zyra thrown into the mix as well, especially if she's an Exalted that ends up being really nice, that ties everything together. The others that add just more Heavenly units and buy yourself time. I've seen people play 4 Heavenly, 4 Duelist, have everything upgraded, and the quality of that gets them to 9, and they don't have to roll for 6 Duelists. They just hit, like Lee Sin 1, but a good core of everything else. And then they have so much economy and so much HP, they just go straight to 9. And you can always just play more duelists. You can play like another Kiana 2, and then incidentally, if you end up rolling for Kiana 3, that she ends up being pretty solid in duelist if you can itemize her correctly. You basically want to just give her the same thing as Lee Sin for the most part. It's an AD melee champion. Or you could just play 2 Volibear 2s. You could also play 2 Lee Sin 2s if you're a super duper high roller. So just more of the same. It all works. For item builds, in general, the items for duelists are a lot of swords, a lot of bows, and some of the support defensive utility items around it. Lee Sin's best slot is Titan's Bloodthirsters plus Stairs Gauge. And this also means that if you end up getting things like Gargantuan Resolve, it ends up being insane on Lee Sin, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The best augments for duelists. You can also throw in other items like Edge of Night onto Lee Sin, especially if it's a burst-oriented meta. Back when people were playing things like Kaisa or Syndra, single target lock on major DPS units, Edge of Night could be really good and works well with things like Not Today, the gold tier augment. You can also just play another source of healing like Hand of Justice, especially if you have Idealism. Or Quicksilver is a pretty underrated item in general in Lee Sin because a lot of people are playing Nautilus in the current meta, and there's a lot of CC that can just interrupt Lee Sin. Or even the Mirror, for example, just, stopping your opponent from stunning you, so that way you can stun them. But just any kind of combination of these items would be really, really good. Kiana actually just utilizes these items pretty well, and she can also carry. Also, some artifacts that are really good that helps enable duelists. Mittens, I think the best one on Lee Sin, just gives him kind of like the tiny but deadly augment in the form of an item. Death Defiance and Infinity Force are just classic melee bruiser attack fighter items. You can also go for other artifacts that are really strong as well, like Diamond Hand and Hole Crusher, Zonias as well. So there's like a lot of things that you could do. It's kind of a shame that Trash or Treasure is no longer a thing because I'm pretty sure this comp could utilize it very, very well. Volibear no longer really wants Bloodthirster Titans. He ends up holding it a lot to transition you to Lee Sin because, again, you're not rolling for Volibear 3 really often. So you can play like an early Volibear with Bloodthirster Titans and then relay that over to Lee Sin. But Volibear now actually just kind of absorbing a lot of the rod items and defensive utility items. Because if you get rods and tiers, what do you do with it? You usually just kind of throw your hands up and be like, well, I low rolled. You just usually put them on Volibear now. Crown Guard, Redemption, Sunfire Spark, Stoneplate Gargoyle. There's actually a build going around. I'm not entirely sure where it surfaced. I think it came from China Mobile, where you had Crown Guard, Stoneplate on Volibear, and then you solo frontline him. You kind of give up a little bit of Sage value, though. You're not really trying to play a lot of Sages in that comp. And instead, you're just playing around like Giga Tank 3-star Volibear. I'm not entirely sure. I've tried a couple times. It hasn't worked out perfectly for me, mainly because it's so hard to get that build online. And you don't want to take Pandora's because you want 3 combat augments. You can give it a try if you want. Tristana wants just leftover AD. Yes, you can go for best in slot. The reality is you go for Lee Sin items first, throw in like, the other utility items onto Volibear, and then just like whatever left over on Tristana. If there's one item you do want to build on Tristana, it's Last Whisper, because you do sometimes just need that armor sundering in the early mid game until you get to Irelia. And if you never get Irelia, then Last Whisper is really, really good. If you do have Even Shroud though, don't build Last Whisper, build something else. Runins is just really good because she's attacking a lot, and Gunblade to help heal the Lee Sin and sustain him so that he can ramp up and get full stacks on everything is really, really important. But again, ultimately just throwing like whatever AD items you can get on her. Irelia Biss is also pretty fake in Duelist. It's very rare you're able to get true Biss on her, which is kind of assembly of a bunch of swords and bows. I mean, if you look at it, it's 3 bows, 2 swords, and a cloak on top of 2 swords and 3 bows. It's just like there's so many bows and swords needed in Duelist. It's just kind of absurd. So you're not really going to ever get it. The most important thing you can put on her is anti-heals, and then just giving her like leftover AD, whatever you can get most games. Let's just go over augments and cover some of the best conditions for you to play Duelists. Fine Vintage is a really powerful silver for Duelists in general because you can stack really insane support items. And I have a slide later on covering what are the best Fine Vintage support items, so don't worry about that. Silver Veil is actually pretty high value for silver. A lot of people don't pick this. I think it's actually really underrated in Duelist because anti-CC and the attack speed is kind of nice. It's just really solid for what you get as a silver value. Both unified resistances are very good because it synergizes really well with the damage reduction for Duelists, and you also tend to line up in a row anyways, so really no punishment for positioning whatsoever. And then Blistering Strikes just saves you the headache of having to build anti-heal, because part of the dynamic of anti-heal that's really awkward in Duelist is you don't have a good item holder for it early. You end up putting like Morello on like a Darius or a Tristana, and then you're just like, it's like it's not even that consistent until you get to Irelia, and then you're like, well, how do I move it? Do I want to sell my Tristana too? You can just skip all that with Blistering Strikes. It's very, very good. Gold augments Keepers is just very OP. Similar to Unified Resistance, Keepers doesn't really punish you for having a position because Duelist wants to clump anyways. And late game Duelists want to get second row value for Sage anyway. So you just kind of all position the front 2 rows and you just get immense shield value. And the flat shields early is just so difficult to cut. You get so much HP. If you think about why Faded is so difficult to deal with, right? If you get Yasuo and Thresh and you pair them together, you get so much shielding. Keepers is kind of like the Yasuo Thresh dynamic on Duelist because you get the damage reduction and you get the shielding, and there's so much flat HP early to cut through, and by the time you get through all the shields, Duelists have cut through your front line and the fight's over. And this also applies to Silver Keepers as well. So both Keepers, very, very good. Oftentimes, if you get it early in the game, that is a complete green light to go for Duelist. Duelist Crash should be pretty straightforward. You get Duelist, you play Duelist. Combat Caster ends up being very good. It's just in general an overtuned augment for anything that ends up casting a lot. And while you don't have a lot of tiers in Duelist, attack speed stacks mana, which helps you cast more often. And the shielding, kind of like Keepers, scales really well with damage reduction. So another really good augment for Duelist. Extended Duel is pretty straightforward. It's just a Duelist augment, so you take it. Faster ramping plus gives you Omnivamp, everything you want. In general, Omnivamp is very good in the comp. So we don't have things like Harm Assist laid out or Healing Orbs, but you can also take those for combat augments. Gargantuan Resolve, stacking stats is just really good on Lee Sin, and you can develop a really good hyper carry. One thing to note is that Gargantuan Resolve does work with the Radiant version of Titan's Resolve as well. So if you can get Gargantuan Resolve and somehow a Radiant Titans, that Lee Sin will be completely unkillable if he sticks around. Prismatics are actually kind of bad for Duelists. You don't really want that many Prismatic augments. So if you do end up in a portal like Prismatic Party, just be cautious about it because there's not that many good prismatic augments for the comp. Duelist Crown is the same straightforward thing as Duelist Crest. It's just a prismatic version of it. Stationary Support and a Compass are really good because in general, you can't really miss because there's so many good support items for Duelists. A lot of the other compositions, they can't utilize things like a Banshee's Veil, a Knight's Vow, some of these more situational melee-oriented support items. But Duelists can utilize everything, and they have some range units as well if you need to put more backline-oriented support items. So very, very good in general in this composition. And then New Recruit just ends up giving you the power of adding really valuable support traits. Sometimes you don't want to have to choose between like Heavenly and Dragon Lords and the Sages. You get to add them all. And if you get like a really powerful emblem late game, this can sometimes be like the clutch factor of giving big team-wide buffs to end up winning the game. One of the big X factors for this composition, we talked about it before, is playing around Exalted. When do you play around Exalted for Duelists? Basically, when you see Diana plus a Duelist in your Exalted. There's a lot of variations you could justify for it. But the best summary I could give is Diana plus a Duelist. In this case, Diana Aurelia, Diana Tristana, Diana Irelia, Diana Volibear, and then you just throw in whatever third unit makes sense. So in this case, Diana Irelia and probably Thresh, since it's a frontline unit that can actually stall and you don't really want to play Kaisa Caitlyn. Diana Tristana, probably Soraka, because she's the heavenly unit that ties in with everything else. Diana Irelia and probably Shen, and you could tie in things like Malphite, or maybe you play Annie and Lilia for the Invokers, and then you just have like a bunch of Duelists that way. Diana Volibear and most likely Lysandra. I'd be very surprised if you play Garen or Yorick, but hey, it's your board. There's more variations that I'm not showing, but in general, just look for Diana and Duelist. And then just to show you the difference between Duelist with Exalted and without, it just shows you an entire placement difference. It just jumps up like a tier and a half of power. I'm pretty sure Exalted is what really makes Duelist S tier, because if you just play Duelist without Exalted, it's pretty good. It's like A tier. But if you get it with Exalted, I mean, it is phenomenal. Positioning tips. Generally, you want to stack Lee Sin and Volibear on the top corners. Volibear is a tank. Lee Sin is the carry. So you have Volibear try to absorb damage, and then Lee Sin punches through. Here's an example of positioning from TFT Academy, although we probably have to update a couple of things, like, you know, for example, the itemization on Volibear. Tristana below the cornered units, and she can go in the second row for Sage value in the mid-late game. So when you get Sages, Tristana in the back 2 rows doesn't do much with AP, so you can put her in the second row. Aim for the same side carries if your enemy carry is ramping and the opposite side if it's bursting. What this means is if someone has an item like Rage Blade, which the more they attack, the more they're stacking attack speed, that's a ramping champion. The longer the fight goes, the more they're ramping. You want to be on the same side because you want to cut them off before they can ramp. But if they're a burst champion because they throw everything at you, like a Kaisa, you want to be on the opposite side because you don't want Lee Sin and Volibear to get a focus down too fast, and instead let yourself ramp up and try to assassinate them later on. Late game, make 2 clumps so you don't get full AoE'd. This is something that happens a lot at higher elos because Nautilus and Hui and Morgana and a bunch of other units that can punish you for full-on clumping, even if you're playing keepers. Make a note of that. And also in this case, I just want to use an example. If you have no Last Whisper, you put Irelia on the same side because she ends up sundering the units in front of like Lisa and Tristana before she moves on to the other units in the back row. So just make sure that you always get that sunder applied ASAP. You don't want inefficiencies. Last but not least, I want to leave you guys with how to play around Fine Vintage, which is really big because Fine Vintage with Duelists more than doubles its win rate. So if you ever see a Fine Vintage start or a possibility for Duelist, you should almost always pick it. The ideal item setup for Fine Vintage is multiple lockets, maximum 3 onto 1 champion, 1 Moonstar Renewer for the shielding, 1 Banshee's Veil, and you give it to Lee Sin and someone else that's really powerful like Wukong. But you might notice that there's only 5 full items. You still want to have regular items to help carry. Even in the old previous Fine Vintage builds, you still need to have items onto, say, like your Irelia for Heavenly. And that's still the case here. You want to still make sure that Irelia has items, or if you're playing Tristana 3, that she has items, and Lee Sin 2 has items. You want to ultimately use support items to be amplifying 1 hyper carry, because that's what Fine Vintage is. It's basically just like giving your super carry extra items. Now your Lee Sin 2 has 5-6 extra items on top of his hyper carry setup. He's going to go crazy. So don't over index all the time, especially late game. You just don't have the opportunity to go for it. Now, in some cases, the set, you're going to have a bunch of extra items because of encounters or portals. What are the different other good items you can have? Virtue of the Martyr is generically good because you get front-loaded healing, and that ends up being really good for the first half of the fight. And duelists really want to end things quickly in the first 15 seconds. Resistance stacking is always good. Locket is cleaner because you can line up in a row, but you can always do Aegis or Randuin's positioning as well. Eternal Flame is surprisingly pretty good. It ends up turning your comp into like a scaling comp where like instead of trying to win in the first half, you're trying to win in the second half. And then all of a sudden you're doing like Lockets to stall. This ends up scaling your board. And then you can always just take utility items like Zephyr and Shroud, which are always like generically okay if you can utilize them correctly. But it is a skillful item because you can always mess up and not get value off of it. So just be mindful that it's a kind of a hard item to use at times. Really, really good if you get a golden remover though, or a Malphite encounter that lets you remove it every single turn. And there's also a couple of other ones that are pretty decent as well. You could always justify like a ZZ Rot, for example, for early game tempo. That ends up just showing you why things like Stationary Support and Accomplice, going back to our items, of why support items are really good in duels because you could utilize so many of them. All right, there you go. How to play Duelist from front to back. Big thank you to Bossoskills again for helping me compile all this information to help you guys climb Infinite LP with Duelist. That's it for me. Let me know if you guys have any other tips for Duelist in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.